This is the Finding Business Happy podcast with me, Janelle McGrath, the founder of Market Veep. This show is all about helping you to live your best life inside and outside of work as a leader in business. Because let's face it, what's important is finding your business happy. Thanks so much today for listening in to the Finding Business Happy podcast. Today, we are geeking out with Glenn Poulos, who's led an incredible journey in sales and has some great life lessons from the sales trenches. And so he is co-founder, vice president, and general manager of Gap Wireless Inc., which is now NWS. He's also the co-founder, the author of Never Sit in the Lobby, a LinkedIn top voice, podcast host, and speaker. And so pretty impressive story. But I'd love to hear from you and share a little bit, if you would, about how you got involved in sales and the story of Gap Wireless.
Hi, Janelle. Thanks for having me. So
yeah,
good to be here. Thanks for the intro.
It's a long list of impressiveness.
Yeah. Hopefully I can live up to it.
I am sure. I'm envious.
So how I got started was I got kicked out of the government for being not a government worker type. My boss told me I was, the wrong fit. And, and I think it was because I was just too gung-ho, working too hard. People in the civil service and whatever have a little bit more of a mundane sort of approach to their day. And, he said, I don't think you're right. I don't think this ideally suits your nature. And he said, you should think about going into sales, right? So I was 24-ish at the time. And it was 1984, 85-ish time frame. It was 85 when I went into sales, 1985. And so I just, went out and looked for a sales job, right? And I went and I joined a pure sales company that just bought equipment from around the world, and we sold it in I handled a territory in Ontario, Canada, right? Southern Ontario. And it grew from there, right? So that's how I got into sales was going and joining a sales company selling high-tech equipment.
Did you fall in love with it right away? Was it like, okay, this is my calling and this is what I've been looking for?
Yeah. So once I, and I have this habit of kind of like fire ready aim, you know what I mean? So it was like, the guy's like, oh, you should get a job in sales. Like the next day I quit and I'm getting a job in sales, right? And it's like, do I do some personality test? No, anyways, but,
look before jumping.
Yeah. So once I realized the leverage that was afforded to a person in sales compared to like the government, where I mathematically knew exactly to the penny how much money I'd be making at different years of my life. You know what I mean? Because I knew the level I was at. I was an EL4, electronic technician 4. I would probably, if I was lucky, grow to a 6. That would take me X number of years. There's 7 bands. Each band is blah, 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 whatever. You'd be making a certain amount. And then in 20-something years, you retire with the government. In Canada, it's called superannuation. I don't exactly know what that is, but it's a pension, basically. And in sales, I realized, you could go from a EL4 to an EL7 in one day just by making a huge sale, right? And I thought, yeah, this is exactly where I belong. But I mean, there's a funny story in the book, right, where I tell about I was driving around Ontario for the government fixing these electronic instruments on weather stations, right? And I was literally driving the crappiest kind of car you could have. It was like a Chevy Chevette, I think they were called, or something. It was these tiny little 2-door junkers in the 80s. It was it was like government green, this drab green. It had crank windows, no air conditioning, no radio. I never thought much of it. That was just the car they gave me to go to the weather stations, right? So I got in, I drove there, and I came back, right? But when I went for my interview, my second interview with the sales company, they sent me to Montreal. The guy picked me up in a BMW 750. And so I'm like, wow, this is, and then when he pulled into the office in Montreal, there were 3 owners in Montreal. There was one in Toronto, and he pulled into his parking spot, and the other 2 owners' cars were there, and they were matching BMW 750s, and the license plates were 1 digit apart. So it was like today we're going to get our BMW 750s, right? And when I saw that, I'm like, I'm definitely getting a job in sales.
Where do I sign? What was it like kind of in those early days, like trying to figure it out? Because, going
So
from government to sales is a
yeah,
different.
so the funny thing was that it was like, I don't know if you ever, this is unrelated, but I don't know if you've ever heard the kind of like, I don't know if it's a joke or just a saying, but I mean, how do you go bankrupt? It's like, well, very, very slowly, then very quickly. Right. And so if in the beginning I was kind of, I was like, just sort of gobsmacked by all the different technologies that this company sold, like for 40 different companies from around the world. So they had this like vast number of companies that they sold for. With each company had a vast number of products. So it was almost an innumerable amount of things you had to learn. Plus you had to learn how to sell these kinds of things and where do you start, whatever. And so for the longest time, while I was sort of like training or whatever, I was kind of like lost. But then once I started getting out there, and again, there's a chapter in the book called Greed-Based Learning, right? Like, and so, but at one point it just clicked, right? And so I kind of forgot your question, but
No, like as you start, right, going from government sales,
yeah,
just being in the government, right, just slower. Like my husband, that's
yeah,
the space he came from. He worked in that for 20 years, and then he
right,
came to work in the business and private,
yeah,
private industry. He's like, whoa, with
wow,
like the timeline and the
yeah,
speed and
yeah,
just a very different pace.
yeah,
So I imagine layering then in sales to
yeah.
that, which is naturally a fast paced segment.
Yeah, and I started to learn. Well, and once I started to learn that, my job was to, was to go and sort of generate interest, establish where I was in the pecking order with the customer. Did I have the right product? Could I sell them mine versus the competitors? And then get the order and move on. I mean, it kind of all clicked, and it was just, it was just off to the races at that point. And it was like I almost felt like it was like I was totally in the dark, completely gobsmacked, and then all of a sudden I figured it out, and I'm like, okay, yeah, I know how to do this. And and of course obviously you get better and better every day, but I mean, and yeah, and then the light just went off. It went on after about 6 months or something like that.
That's pretty quick.
Yeah,
I think, a lot of the stories in your book, I think, as a salesperson, super relatable in terms of like the types of experience that you've
yeah,
encountered and making it feel very natural, even though it might be an uncomfortable situation, which I
yes,
think as
yeah.
salespeople, you come across on a weekly, if not daily basis sometimes, and it can be surprising. But it's a very human approach to sales, I think. So tell me, like, in terms of how you jumped there, and then how did Gap Wireless come about?
So I've actually built and sold two companies. So I quit my job in 85 and I went into sales working for these guys, these four owners, right? And in 1991, I was on the cusp of turning 30, and I wanted to like start my own business before I turned 30, right?
Mhm.
And when I realized, I got in the BMW in Montreal, and I realized, hey, if I can be in sales, then I can go from a Chevy Chevette to a BMW, maybe not in one step, but in a couple of steps. But anyways, and then I realized what I really needed to do was that they were the owners. So they were getting paid when I sold, but I were also getting paid when they sold, and every other salesman was selling, right? So I
Yep.
realized like you have a lot of leverage when you're a salesperson in terms of controlling your income. But when you can strike out on your own and run your own sales company, you have even more leverage, right? And
Mhm.
so in 1991, I approached those four owners and I said, I have an idea to spin off a piece of your company, a small area where you're not focusing on. They were focusing on like military testing equipment and things that the, military contractors were buying, Raytheon and Rockwell and people like that. And I wanted to spin off this newfangled technology. And I said, hey, you can own some of it, but I'm going to own some of it this time too, right?
Mhm.
And that way I get to be an entrepreneur, and you get to, and I'll take a couple of your vendors, and I'll sign up my own other vendors, and I'll do the exact, now you'll have two companies, and I'll have at least own part of one of them, right? And the president guy says, no, that'll never work. And he said, you'll be way better off just sticking at it here and da 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 da. And I literally quit the next day. I quit my job, and I just went in with a letter and I dropped it on the table. And that's my whole ready, fire, aim thing, right? And I always love telling the part that day that I dropped it off was 6 days after I got married. And so,
Very patient wife.
well, no, she didn't know anything about it. She didn't know until I went home and told her I quit. And 6 days into the marriage, I'm like, oh, I quit my job. And she's like, what? And I like, don't worry, it'll be fine. And so, yeah, so that newfangled technology that I wanted to start the company on was the cell phone industry, right? And of course, that never went anywhere, right? Like, I mean, who needs a cell phone, right? And
you bet on that. You bet on the wrong horse there for sure.
Yeah. And so and it wasn't selling cell phones; it was selling equipment to people that build cell phone networks, right? So to Verizon, AT&T in Canada, it's Bell, Telus, Rogers, people like that, right? And so anyone building, owning, and operating a mobile wireless network, and those were our customers, right? And so I ran that company for 15 years and sold it, and then I got an opportunity to start another company and make some changes, which is when I started Gap Wireless, which is the G and the P in my name, right?
Okay.
And the A is the vowel that I needed in order to make a word. So in 2007, I was able to start Gap Wireless, which I ran with a partner until 2022. And then we sold it to a company called NWS. And now I'm the vice president and general manager of NWS. I used to be the vice president and general manager of Gap Wireless, and my partner was the president. He sold and he's left. But yeah, I always focused on running. I'm the integrator in the business. If you're familiar with the EOS operating system, so my role is the integrator. Yeah,
awesome.
Yeah, and so that's why
pretty incredible.
Yeah. So that's how I ended up in Gap Wireless
and avoided a gap issue.
Yeah.
I mean, many times I think, companies think, well, when I get bigger, it gets easier, whether that be like in sales and operations and integrating all of these pieces, looking at the life cycle of kind of how you've taken the company, like where you started, not in ownership, moving through that full acquisition and exit strategy. What do you think is, in your perspective, in the sales process is so important in closing the deals? Like, does it change as you go through those pieces?
Not really. I mean, the biggest thing, with sales and, the way people sell changes somewhat a little bit over time. But at the end of the day, when you're selling high value things, it's really done people to people. And I mean, some things can be done online, but I mean, this is a common argument I have with people that you don't need to make sales calls and, and things like that. And I mean, if you've ever bought like a software product or something like that, then they kind of like have a way of doing it all online through a series of Zoom calls and what have you. But I have all sorts of arguments I can purport to them onto why the losing people didn't know they were losing because they never came and called on me. Right.
Yeah.
And so, to me, sales has never really changed. And I mean, but it is a topic of discussion and debate, right? Because people are like, oh, no, you can do it on Zoom and this and that, whatever. And I'm like, yeah, you can. But the real top earners that I know are not doing it that way. Right. And because it's all about rapport for me. Right. And the subtitle of the book, which is not on the book, is like how to get, act, and stay in front of your customers and to be a pleasure to do business with always, right? That's my mantra.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's about how do you get in front of the customer, stay in front of the customer, act in front of the customer, and be a pleasure to do business with no matter what, even when you're losing the deal, right? So that they'll always want to bring you back. They'll actually desire to bring you back when you lose because they felt so bad not allowing you to win. They want to give you another chance. And they may even not even like the guy they're buying the product from, but they're stuck for one reason or another, right?
Yeah.
Because I've always worked in an environment where it wasn't once and you're done. It was like we were dealing with large companies that would buy many things over time, and there was always competition, and it was always a battle. And you, over time, you would get to know, many people in the organization.
Gotcha.
And so if you were distasteful after losing a deal, they may not be so incentivized to call you back for the next deal because you were a jerk, right?
Yeah.
Or the opposite can also be true, which is what I suggest, right?
I
And
think it's interesting too, because I know for us, when we lose a deal, people will come back like years later. And I think people think like, well, if they don't come back, I know that they were signing a 6-month contract with whatever other vendor they picked or whatever
right.
product. But like sometimes it takes a long time, or they left that job, but you had developed such a good rapport with them that they file that away. They've moved on to a new job, and there's a different opportunity with a completely different minded decision maker. And it's a much better collaboration and fit for the organization. But to your point, to just shut the door and be,
Yeah.
not very
And so,
kind.
yeah. And so if I can shamelessly plug some of my rules, right? I mean, in those situations where that's occurring, the first thing is, I have one rule that I'd rather be last than second, right?
Mhm.
And so that rule, the way it breaks down is that, you're in there competing, you're being a pleasure to do business with. And all of a sudden you get to a point, could be at any point, it could be on the first day, or it could be halfway through, or at any point in the cycle, you realize it's absolutely impossible for you to get the deal. Like you're not going to win. Right.
Mhm.
And so a lot of people go, oh, let me call the vice president in and we'll fly them to the factory and we'll do this. We'll take them golfing and buy them a steak dinner and we'll, and blah, blah, blah. That's not what I do. The second that I realize that I can't win, and again, I'm making a decision that I know that I can't win because there's a contract, there's a feature, there's something, right?
Yeah.
I immediately politely excuse myself from the race, right? And I go and run a different race. And so I go find another customer as soon as humanly possible and start working on that one
Mhm.
where I feel I'm a better fit. And I allow the other people to fly them to their factories to go, because they're all occupied
Yeah.
losing, and I go and find a new winning battle to fight, right? And it's by doing it graciously and whatever, and I just graciously, recuse myself from the situation, right? And or we say, well, for this reason, the reason we decline to participate, we can't win, we can't da da da. I'm sorry, blah blah blah, and whatever. You're nice about it, and then like you said about the 6 month, right? Like let's say that was the thing. Let's say it was a 6 month deal, right? I would
Mhm.
call them at 4 months or 5 months, right? And I would say, hey, I'm in the lobby next week. Can I get 5 minutes of your time? I want to drop something off to you, right? And
Yeah.
it's a coffee mug, it's a literature, it's a brochure, it's whatever. Oh, how's your software you bought 6 months ago? How are they treating you? Oh, they suck. And blah, blah, blah. And I said, oh, well, why don't you give me a little mini tour of how it's working in your facility and show me how it's working and whatever. Let's see, I'll come back to you with some ideas. No pressure, no, because they're, and now again, and that's the way I do it over and over again for 40 years in my career. That's exactly how I've done it. And so I don't wait till month 8 when they've already flipped over to a logo that, they forgot to call me or something. And,
Yeah.
you know,
Because I think it's interesting because you don't usually hear a salesperson giving up until they say the prospect says no. So what would that conversation sound like to that once you've identified that it's time to part ways?
So I would literally like jump in the lion's mouth and I would say again, I was always selling things that were equipment related, right? So I mean, it
Mhm.
could be software, could be hardware, could be services, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But I would say our instrument or our system is just not capable of the throughput that you're looking for on this particular situation on this production line. You need 20 units per minute and I can only do 12, right? Like
Yeah.
there's absolutely no way for us to reasonably participate. We're going to have to graciously decline to set up a demo, or because we just can't meet. Can you live with 12? Well, that's all we can do. No. Okay, well then let's save you time. You can work with brands B, C, and D, and the one we already know you're going to buy,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yeah.
that's where my head's at, because I know my competition, right?
Mhm.
And it's only one of a whole lifetime. I'm not losing forever. I'm only losing that deal, and I'm not losing. I'm winning because the other people, right? are,
Mhm.
like they say, well, what is the guy who comes in second? He's the first loser, right? Like, and so I lose early, and I'm just like, I win by refusing to participate, and I
Mhm.
excuse myself from the thing, and I move on. But the trick is that it's not like I go home and mope about it, right? I
Yeah.
literally make 3 calls on the way back to the office to find something new to work on, and they
Yep.
can't be in 2 places at one time. And you're dealing with territories, and you're dealing with salespeople that have limited, there's only a finite number of them, right? So
Mhm.
if you're dealing with Jack in Southern Ontario or Bob in New York City, Bob can't be at Citibank and at, whatever, Chase Manhattan or something at the same time. So I'd literally go across the street to Chase Manhattan and say, hey, what are you guys doing for your HRIS system? Right. And,
Yeah.
blah, 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 and whatever. And I would try to get on find a new deal. Right. And, but I mean, it's all happening at the same time, right? Like, I'm constantly trying to find people to talk to. I'm constantly trying to working deals through different points in the cycle. It's just
Mhm.
that it's better to be last than second.
Yeah.
And
I think the weighting, right? Like the weight of each deal, the likelihood to close, and thinking about how much investment of your time and energy is it actually going to get close to the line, or what are my odds, and pulling out ahead. I think is such a
yeah,
great
no,
tip.
of course, obviously, I'm not saying like, oh, that's a tough day, so I quit. Like, I mean, it's
No.
like, yeah, you basically, what I'm saying is when you're at the point where you know categorically that you can't win,
Mhm.
right? That's when you want to stop. And what I really mean is like, what people end up doing is like they end up doubling down on the bad behavior, right? Like it's not like you have to walk away, but you could refuse to send in a demo. You could basically, you know what I mean? Like, you got to fly in maybe it's a huge system that costs like $1,500 to ship in, and you got to bring in an engineer to connect it, or like, and it's not going to work, right? You just say, hey,
Yeah.
we can't get you a demo for 8 weeks, like, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And you just like sort of like becomes difficult to participate. They're like, well, if you can't get a demo in 6 weeks, then we're going to only be looking at brands A, C, and D. And you're like,
Mhm.
okay, yeah, it's too bad, but I mean, our systems, it's in such high demand in the capital region that we can't, I can't move a system right now. And again, I mean, that is true in a way, because the problem is like putting demos at customers that won't be buying the product is a colossal waste of the most valuable assets that you have.
Yeah.
Right? If a customer asks me for a demo, like in the book, I talk about this in the book. Customer asks me for a demo, I ask them. No, I always ask them, how long do you need it for? And no matter what they say, I always say, oh my god. And they're like, what? And I'm like, oh no, I could. There's no way I can give it to you for, like, let's say they say a week, right? I'm like,
Mhm.
there's no way I can leave it for a week. I said I can give you maybe 2 days, but I got to get it out to Toronto, or I got to go somewhere, blah blah blah. I got to get it, like,
The
or let's say he says
urgency.
I need it for a month, and maybe I have it for a month or whatever, and I could give it to him, right? I'm like, oh no, 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 like a week's the maximum, and they're like, okay, fine, ship it in. I go, no, we have a policy, I can't ship demos, and they're like, what? And so, in the rule in the book is never ship the shit or fax the facts, right?
Mhm.
And so, because the reason why is what you end up happening is you ship it in, and your brand B, they really want to buy brand A. You're only there to keep the guys honest. They don't even open your box, right? Or they
Yeah.
open it an hour before the month that they begged you to keep it for, to look at it quickly for 5 minutes to tell their boss that they did. I go in, I set it up for them. I'm there the day it's delivered. Then I
Mhm.
have a surprise visit halfway through, whatever the time period is, a week, that I come back halfway through, and then I come back to pick it up. And they're like,
Love
oh,
it.
no, you don't have to need to go to all that trouble. Like, we'll ship you to it. I go, well, no, I'm already in the building visiting so and so. I'll just pick it up when I'm done. And they're like, oh, well, if you're here, that's fine. But then I'm not. So I say, I know I can be back in a week to pick it up. So then I call the other guy and I say, hey, you know what? I'm in the building picking up a demo. Can I talk to you for, and so, and that's why I never had to prospect for what to do with my time, because my time was always pre-booked before I even, ahead of time, right?
Yeah. I think the urgency, right, of like, in the FOMO of, if I can't have it that long and somebody else is going to get it, I got
Right.
to get it on the calendar as quick as possible. But I think to your earlier point too, even around the prospecting and like saying we're not a fit, I think the honesty in that sales process actually, I found, wins more deals, because they're like, you're willing to turn down business when you openly know that we are not a fit. I'll refer you to somebody who's a better fit.
That's right.
Um, but
And
then
I've
there's
done that.
a
Yeah.
better level of trust between what is possible or better collaboration as the relationship goes on.
Yeah.
In the book, I mean, there's 57 awesome must-learn tactics, but what do you think are like the absolute most important, the 3 things that most salespeople do and they should be avoiding? You could like tell the world.
Yeah. So the probably the one of the biggest mistakes, and I'm not sure how I call it out like in black and white in the book though, but I like to share it, is like they always are confusing marketing with selling, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, and I mean, there are some people that work in marketing, and that's fine and dandy, but usually you're not a person that's a sales and marketing person. You're either one or the other, right? You might work in the sales and marketing team. The difference is that when you're standing in front of the customer, either virtually on Zoom or in their lobby and they're talking to them face to face or whatever, that's selling. Everything else is marketing. Okay.
I'm going to make sure to clip this section and share it everywhere because we're in marketing and I'm a salesperson. We have this conversation with sales teams all the time of marketing ends here. You guys take it and you run here.
Right.
And these are the 2 lanes that we need to be working together on.
Exactly. And so they confuse sales and marketing, and they're more comfortable. And I mean that in the truest sense of the word, doing the marketing. And that's why I say, like in my building, the sales room is the only room where the nails in the chair are pointed up. Right. And so the chairs are very uncomfortable in the sales room because we're not paying them to be in the office doing lead generation on LinkedIn and like, oh, Monday I do my LinkedIn in the morning, whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
My Monday's already pre-booked 3 weeks ago because I'd had stops along the way and I geographically know which part of the province or state or whatever that I'm going to be in. And everything I'm doing is to fill up that day long before it. So I don't need to go on and yes, I use LinkedIn and I do those things, but I mean, I don't make them into huge events or whatever. They're sort of filling in the gaps. And so I'm always trying to be in front of customers as much as possible because that's the role of the sales people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, so that's one of the things one of the golden rules, and is to try to act and stay in front of your customers, right? And be a pleasure to do business with always, right?
Yeah.
And so the other thing is like, and I go on fairly ad nauseum about this in the book about rapport, building rapport and understanding what it means to show empathy, sympathy, and compassion, to know what the difference is between them, and to, I find most people really don't really know how to show empathy and how to truly put yourself in the other person's shoes and experience what they're experiencing. And that's when you can truly see what's at stake for them, because most people are blinded by, well, I got to sell this product because it sells for 20 grand and I get this amount of commission.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what's going through their brain. Right. And that's not what that guy's thinking. That guy's thinking, I need this instrument that costs 20 grand because it's going to reduce my packing time by 25%. And I'm going to be able to pack 25 more packages per hour, which means I'm going to be able to ship more things, which is going to put money in my pocket.
Yeah.
Right.
The full reverse.
Right. And so I find it's very important to show rapport and do that in a natural and genuine way. Right. And so there's stories in the book about don't make these mistakes about, like, there's one story called Implied Familiarity Also Breeds Contempt. Right. Where, the actual saying is familiarity breeds contempt, right? If you hang around with someone too long, you can't even stand the way they breathe, right? Because they're hyper familiar to you, right? And you need a break,
Yes. A small timeout.
Yeah, you need timeouts, right? And things like that, because it's hyper familiar. And so, but I made up this little funny saying of implying familiarity also breeds contempt, meaning pretending I'm familiar with you and know you.
Yeah.
Right. By looking at my surroundings and guessing about you, right? And so, I can't, they're too far away, but I see you have pictures and things behind you in your set there. But I might make a comment about something on that shelf, but really it's got nothing to do with you. Maybe it's, your husband or your roommate or someone else's thing, and you don't even like it. It's just actually annoying, but you're using their studio today, and you see what I mean? And so it's better to say, oh, well, what's the story behind all those photographs behind you, and da da da, and like, and then you allow it to come out naturally, right?
Yeah.
And golf games and dinners are for customers that have long, they're to reward positive behavior by the customer, not to inspire behavior that you're hoping for, right?
Yeah. I think the pushiness, right? When I think about, you know, generally how the general public perceives a salesperson as pushy and only after what they want.
Right.
But, thinking about all of the salespeople I've come across in the last 20 years is they're not like that. So one of the best sales trainers I've ever worked with, he said something that always stuck with me years ago. He said, introverts make some of the best salespeople because they are so self-reflective
Right.
of how somebody else is going to perceive what they're about to tell them. And
Right.
so, I think to what you're saying, don't just assume, like ask,
Exactly. Yeah.
take that.
Exactly. And yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
You've been in sales for decades too. And I think it's a special mindset. You've already talked about that attitude of, I'm going to stop working on this one, but I already know I'm not going to mope. I'm going to go out and find 3 more and actively work on it. And it takes a special person, I think, to be able to have that. We talk about grit, like one of our values is grit. And so how do you stay motivated? And, what are some important factors that salespeople should keep in mind and, to help them along that impact?
Yeah. So whenever people ask me that, I'm saying, well, like the true answer is that I'm really greedy. And so I'm motivated by, I'm not paid to like sit around and not sell. Right. And so, and that behavior sort of gets me what I want, which is, to be able to buy nice things and live a good life and whatever. Right. And so, I mean, I say it to kind of be bold and funny and whatever, but it's also very true. Right. I mean, obviously I pick sales because you can make a lot of money, and it's not like I could also have like studied for 15 years and become some kind of brain surgeon or whatever and make a lot of money. Right.
Yep.
But I mean, I didn't have to go to school for 15 years.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I did go to a little bit of college, but I didn't have to go for 15 years, right? And so the relationship between how well you can do in the career and how much just for being street smart and motivated and self-starter and all that stuff, right? You don't have to have an 8-year college degree or anything like that. It's not mandatory, right? And so,
Yeah.
but I'm motivated a lot of times by the fact that I've learned over time that, sometimes it's hard to get out and get in front of yourself to be in front of the customers. But once you actually get there, that's actually the best part of your day. And you have to keep reminding yourself of that. And it's not hard to convince yourself of it because you know that it's true, right? And you could be fighting with your spouse or whatever, even all the way there in the car, on the phone, blah, blah, blah. You didn't do this. You didn't cut the grass and whatever, something like that. And I'll do it later. And, I forgot, whatever, right? Da, 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 da. And then you hang up the phone, you walk in, and all that's behind you. And you're actually like on set, and you're kind of performing and you're in character, and you have to be a specific kind of person and behave in a certain way. Right. And so I motivate myself by just knowing that's the best part of, of my day, is being able to do that versus paperwork and updating the funnel and stuff like that. Right.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that is such a good point too. Cause I think especially as like an owner, a business leader, like there are moments where there might be external situations going on, but you have to like almost like feels like flip a switch of like, okay, I can't be upset now. I have to turn it on and like be this other role or put on a different hat to try to do this completely different part of my job.
Right.
And it's definitely a different muscle, I think.
Yeah.
Unless you're in sales, I don't know. I don't know if there's other. I haven't come across other roles, but I'm sure there are.
Yeah.
But it definitely feels like a back and forth many days. You have an awesome story, the book. It's called 10 Million in Diamonds. And I think it was such a great takeaway for all different industries, not just sales. But I'd love for you to share, if you don't mind, that
Mhm.
particular story and why you put it in the book.
Yeah. So my first real sales job was at Sears selling jewelry in the jewelry department. And the guy was my boss was the watchmaker, Romeo. And he was this guy with polio. And he was like super affected. Like this was back in the 70s, right? So you don't see many people with polio these days. And so he wasn't always in a wheelchair, but sometimes he was, and sometimes he had a cane, and he was very tiny, but he was a very good watchmaker, and he was an incredible like human being, right? And he lived this crazy vivacious life, and although he was never married or whatever, he was always out dating, and much to everyone's surprise, right? And so one day
Most
he
salespeople, right, are
yeah,
great daters.
yeah, yeah, seriously. And
How we
so
learn.
one day he left to start his dream, which was to not work in the jewelry department at Sears, and he just opened his own jewelry store, which he did. And then, and of course, I stayed where I was. Then I moved on, and I went to school, and I moved away, and then I came back to town, and it was like 10 years later, right? I drove down the street in St. Catharines, Ontario, near Niagara Falls, and I saw his jewelry store, and I thought, oh my God, I wonder if he'll remember me, right? And so I went in the store, and the lady that was working there actually knew me as well because she worked at Sears, right? And so I said, "Oh, is Romeo there?" "Oh, yeah, he's in the back, da, 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 whatever, fixing watches, right?" And the she says, "Let me go get him," and he comes out, and he's like, and and I'm like, "Oh my God, Romeo, it's so good to see you," and he's like, "Oh yeah, it's so good to see you, so good to see you," right? And I'm like, "How's it going?" He goes, "Oh my God, it's so busy, it's so busy," and so we're talking for a little bit, and then at one point he says to me, he says, Glenn, he says, "I could be making $10 million to selling the diamonds, but I am so busy fixing watches all day." And I mean, at the time, it took time for it to sink in, right? I mean, I was just listening to him, but then later I'm like, why don't you just stop fixing watches and sell diamonds, right? And yeah, and so don't lose sight of the diamonds when you're fixing watches, right? And
Such a
yeah,
great
yeah,
takeaway, because I think, you get busy and life happens and sales come and go, and you're doing the best you can every day, but everybody has a completely different goal. And I think we talk about even just general KPIs, sales KPIs, marketing KPIs, overall company KPIs, and they get so stuck in the weeds and lose sight of why it's important to do annual planning and quarterly planning and staying so focused on the big picture,
yeah,
not just the tasks at hand. But I love that. I'm gonna put it on my bulletin board to remember.
yeah. And all you need to tell people once they know it is just say $10 million in diamonds, right? You don't need to tell them the whole story, right?
Right?
It's just, yeah,
It's such a great one.
yeah, yeah,
My
it's good.
other favorite story in the book, and I think is a lot of times we have, when I think of salespeople, they have a lot of playbooks and rules, but it becomes almost like a sterile environment for like sales, right? Everybody starts sounding the same, or they don't go off script. To your point, they don't have like human interactions and make it truly about the other person necessarily. They just assume. And so, I think the story essentially from the Canada subdivision that you grew from 2 million to 50 million plus, and just how you were able to kind of infuse humor and personality into that presentation. I'd love for you to share that, because I think it's such a great way to think about when you have to be in front of people, what their experience is like and how impactful that is.
Yeah, but you have to remind me the was
Yeah.
a
So
little bit more about the story because
yeah.
yeah.
So you were presenting in front of 100 executives who were from
Oh, that.
multi-billion dollar
Oh,
corporations.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, so I do believe that I think now I remember the story you're talking about. So I had to fly to Japan actually, and I took a job managing this division for them. I still had my company, my original company before Gap, and I was running their company for them in Canada as well. And I was kind of the small guy on campus. And then when I took over the business, it was only $2 million in sales. And every year there was this meeting of the country managers, and there were like 50 managers, and then the 50 guys from the head office in Japan. And so this was my first time attending. And it happened to be in Japan that year. So it was and it was my first trip to Japan.
Just
And
no
I was,
pressure.
Yeah, no pressure, right? And I was like, I guess I was early 30s, I guess at this point. Yeah. And I was traveling with the president of the US operation, which was my boss. Okay. And so the, and so it turned out that I was early in the morning of the first day. My presentation was like the third or fourth presentation, and my boss was actually right after me. And so
Oh, gosh.
yeah. And so I was a little bit nervous or whatever, right? So I go up in this giant room in Japan in front of 100 guys, and I just started and I said, "Oh, ohayou gozaimasu. O genki desu ka? Yoi o tenki desu ne." Right? And everyone starts looking at me. I said, "Oh, should I switch to English?" And and because and everybody thought that this guy's like fluent in Japanese, right? And so when I sat down, of course, I did the rest of it, and I was just saying like, "Oh, it's so nice to be here. What a beautiful day it is," and something like that, right? And all the Japanese guys afterwards came up to me, and they're like, "Oh, yours was so good. We really liked your presentation," and it was the same as everyone else. We all had the same 5 slides we had to fill in with the data, right? I mean, it's 50 guys doing the same thing, right? And my boss, I sat down beside the president of the US thing, who was much bigger than my division at the time from Canada, right? And he swore at me. He said, "I should have thought of that." And and it was definitely an awesome moment. And so I've actually reproduced that many times in many languages, right? And whenever there's an opportunity where, and I just learned 2 or 3 sentences in a different language, and then I immediately say, "Oh, should I switch back to English for everybody?" And no one ever really knows, right? And sometimes they do, or they confront you later, or whatever, and it's all funny. But it's an awesome little trick, and yeah. So.
I loved it. I think it was a nice way to make them feel like you heard them and you listened to them and you connected with them through such a simple act of humor. Because there's nothing like, I think, getting a room full of people to laugh and connect, not just with the speaker, but with each other, like that bonding moment. It helps them absorb everything else. Yeah. But I loved it. I thought it was a great idea.
And it's not in the book, but I mean, it's on the website, and there's a banner at the top, and it's free, and it's called the How to Do the Perfect Presentation, and it's called the Punch, Perfect Pitch, and Close, right?
Okay.
And it's kind of a takeoff on that, but it's like how I break down my presentations into the punch, the perfect pitch, and then the close, right? Mm-hmm. And the punch is kind of like that. What I did when I spoke in Japanese, that was the punch, right?
Yeah.
And most people start off with like, "Oh, let me describe the weather in Canada," right? Mm-hmm. Or, you know what I mean? Like, Canada is in the northern part of North America with a population of 30 million people, whatever, right? And by then everybody's already asleep, and so I like to punch the audience as the first part of any kind of, presentation. And nowadays I usually do that with an emotional clip of some sort or another that allows them to experience the state I want them to be in later when they own the product, right? And get them there right away. And then using the power of 3, which is in the book, tell them what I'm going to tell them, then tell them what I told them. I break it down into parts of 3, and at the end, the close is easy, because if they aren't asking you how much it costs and how to buy it, then I failed. And I need to start over again and at the beginning and on a different day, right? And that's the punch, perfect pitch, and close, right? In a nutshell.
Well, make sure to include the asset too and the follow up resources so people can download.
Please. It's free download, and you can get it anytime you want.
Yeah. And then you had one other one that I think it's across any industry, any role, is the zero inbox.
Right.
And like,
this is very controversial with some people.
Oh my. Let's do it.
Yeah. So because I've learned to actually ask people. This is one where implied familiarity also breeds contempt, right? Where now I ask people like, "Oh, well, how do you handle your inbox?" Like, I mean, I said, "How many emails do you have in your inbox right now?" I usually ask that now because I've embarrassed myself a few times, because I used to say like, "Oh, I mean, I meet these like idiots that had 70,000 emails in their inbox," and the guy's like, "I got 50,000 in mine."
Oh,
and I'm
no.
like, "Uh-oh." Right? And so for me, like the perfect state is when your inbox is at zero, right? And so, and I mean, like, this is not rocket science or whatever, right? But when emails come in, I either action them right away, right? Or I snooze them until the appropriate moment, or I assign them to someone else, or I delete them, right? And so my strategy is to always be approaching or at or near, zero, right? And we've been on the phone an hour, but I mean, when I got on the phone, there were like 5 things in my inbox, and they were all present moment waiting for real time answers. Like, not even, otherwise I would have snoozed them. Right. If the answer, if I was waiting for something from you, like, I made some notes for today just as for a helping guide and whatever. And I snoozed it till 5 minutes before this call months ago when we booked the call, right?
Yeah.
Like, I did the work months ago. I wrote the note and I created a second calendar item beside the calendar item for your podcast. And it's called Notes for Podcasts. And there's also an email that went with it. And I snoozed it so that it would pop up in my inbox in just enough time that I would remember that it was there and that I could reference it. And so I believe that, an inbox should always be at zero, right? And I mean, that's really just my philosophy. And a lot of people are like, no, I have all my emails in there. And then but how do you possibly stay focused when you're looking at 70,000 things? And there was a guy that I fired, and he had 71,000 emails in his inbox. And I went to the bottom. The first one was welcome to Gap Wireless. Right. And I'm thinking, like, that's why we never got along. Right. Like, we just think so differently. Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I use a system called Front for our email, but many people use Outlook. The new Outlook has the snooze feature now too. So you can snooze it till exact moment that you need it back, right? So if I send you an email and I'm expecting a response from you, then I'll use the snooze function to say, I think that Janelle should respond to me by Thursday at 2 p.m., right? So Thursday at 2 p.m. it'll pop up. And that's when I'll contact you, and then I will probably phone you. And if I phone you and you don't answer, then I'm going to use my voicemail strategy, 20 to 30 second voicemail, get to the point, don't waste time. And then I'll follow it up with an email. And, and again, those are all parts of the 57 rules that I follow. Right. And then I'll snooze it again, right, to an appropriate amount of time. Eventually there may be, the lead might go cold and I would delete it at that point. Right. And
I think everybody needs an email system, like a process. It blows my mind when we talk to people and they're like, they don't even have folders. I'm like, how do you prioritize, or how do you know you didn't miss something, or was it timely? I mean, we use Gmail and is our system. But it will say, like, this person hasn't responded in a certain number of days. I mean, other than that, if somebody doesn't have a system in place, especially in sales, I mean, it's so timely.
Yeah.
Or even in the service side, timeliness. So I'm a firm believer. I agree. I think zeroing out the inbox, I'm happy if I can keep it under 50 and work towards zero. But I think it's wonderful. What are 2 things that you think you would want listeners to take away from today's episode?
Well, I guess one thing would be stay focused. Don't let distractions pull you away from what really matters. And the water cooler is just meant to go fill up your water bottle and go back to your desk, right?
Sit on those tax chairs.
Yeah, exactly. Whether it's closing a deal or building a relationship, the other thing is, try to be authentic, because, you can't replace authenticity, right? It's hard to fake. And so just be authentic and be a pleasure to do business with, right? And people will enjoy seeing you. And then again, there's all sorts of rules in the book about remembering people's names and how do you do it, and all sorts of things. Even there's chapters in there on how to behave at lunch and dinner, right? And then people are like, why did you have that in the book, right? And I'm like, because
important.
Read the story about Mike Quigley and you'll know why, right? Because if you've ever been out to lunch with that guy, you'll know why, right? And so those are a couple things.
Wonderful. And then finally, last question, what does finding business happy mean to you?
I guess finding business happy would mean, sort of like kind of aligning my activity during the day with things that I enjoy, right? Like, I mean, don't want to pick on this, but I mean, I'm not sure I'd be happy selling dental instruments or whatever. It's not cool. Like, I mean, I'm kind of like a button kind of gizmo geeky kind of thing. And so, I've always been selling equipment that's state of the art, and, and that's oftentimes when I'm hiring salespeople, and in technical schools and I'm trying to hire recruits and they're like, well, I'd rather be an engineer than sell and whatever. And I'm like, yeah, but if you join a company like Rockwell, you're going to go into that lab and there's going to be an equipment there. It's probably 5 years old. And guess what? 5 years from now, it'll still be the same equipment. Tomorrow and the day after, I'll be selling tomorrow's equipment today. And every year I'll be selling the latest and greatest. I will always be on the cutting edge of technology because that's what I'm bringing to the market. And so sales allows me to sell and interact with the latest and greatest of my particular genre of equipment, right? And so, and I love, like I said, I love gizmos and things like that, right? I mean, I would probably be happier selling like professional audio equipment and things like that because I find that even more cool. But I mean, I'm as close as perfect as I can get selling electronics and, things that plug in and have lights and buttons and knobs and things like that on it.
You got to love what you're doing.
Yeah.
I think especially in sales, you have to be passionate about whatever it is. Awesome advice. Thank you so much for all of your insights. Amazing stories. Highly recommend the book. Definitely check it out. But thank you, Glenn, for joining us. And have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone. Thank you for listening in. We'll make sure to drop all the resources from Glenn and the episode resources. And until next time, talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to Finding Business Happy with me, Janelle McGrath, the founder of Market Veep. If you want a roadmap to finding and keeping your business happy, download our free guide now at marketveep.com/happy.